Recording has started. We had a little bit of a tech issue there. If you saw 10 to 15 seconds of nothing, then that's what you saw. Okay. Welcome back to the August 22nd study hall. We've seen the rules. We have also seen the guidelines for submissions and so on. Today's topic is more assumption problems carryover from last time. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, when we say give me a smiley face, we're talking about this emoticon smiley face that is here. And then also when we give you a multiple choice question, please keep in mind that the GMAT doesn't let you not answer questions. So, I mean, on here, there's only so much I can do to like force you to answer a question, but when you're taking the actual GMAT, you have to. It forces you to answer the question, or at least if you don't answer the question, it will just sit there and wait until you do. So in order to sort of promote the same type of thing, we want to make sure that everybody answers all the problems here. So please don't non-respond. And then when you answer the questions, please answer them on the multiple choice polling tools. Please do not post a letter in the chat box. Thank you. And then finally, the copyright notice that we have to give you. The problems here are from the GMAT prep software. In fact, all of them are today. So in fact, you're going to see literal screenshots from the GMAT prep software today. So copyright GMAT, the free problems are allowed to be used here is basically the deal. The ones that are from the GMAT prep software, we can use those. We can't use the ones from the OG because that is paid material, and that's the difference, in case anyone's wondering about that. Okay, so let's jump into a problem. How about this one? Okay, so here's a timer. And remember to please use the multiple choice options that are located there. Give it a shot. All right, we still have some non-responses, but please go ahead and pick something that is something. In other words, please pick a multiple choice answer. I'll give you another like 5 or 10 seconds to do that, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so let's take a look. We do have an interesting pattern of responses here. There's still about 3-4 non-responders, so let me give you like 5 more seconds to respond to this. Okay, so let's take a look here. And again, we did do an installment on assumptions in the last study hall, so a couple of the main principles we're going to go through faster than we did last time, just to make sure that we can get to some more content here. So let's just summarize if you didn't watch the last session, then of course check out that recording of that one. But what we've learned about assumption problems in general, if it's hard to read, then the best thing you can do there is just make the window bigger. if you make the window bigger, you should not have a terribly hard time reading it. But yeah, so I apologize if it is hard to read, but it's basically the color. Yeah, okay, I can kind of see that. Again, making the screen bigger would probably help you if that's an issue. Okay, so what we've learned. The recordings are all on the regular Thursdays webpage. You can scroll down. Just go to where Thursdays with Ron is and scroll down. Okay. What we learned from last time about these things. First of all, let me just give you a brief executive summary, and then if any of these things are incredibly unclear, feel free to ask for a little bit of further clarification on whatever point is unclear. So one thing that we learned about assumption problems is what an assumption actually is. So what is this thing anyway? So there's basically two qualities that assumptions have. They are not mentioned in the passage explicitly, and then they must be true. It's needed or required or necessary for the argument to work logically. Okay, and then how do you find assumptions? Because again, the task here is an interesting task. What I mean by interesting is the sense that you're trying to find things that are not there. In other words, you're trying to kind of just magic them out of thin air. So if you're going to try to find them directly, then you have to use thought processes that sort of penetrate to the ideas that are not actually there. So how do you do that? How can you find assumptions considering that they are things that aren't mentioned? Well, one thing you can do to find assumptions is to ask yourself whether there's any like missing connections. Like if the argument just sort of jumps from one idea to another without an adequate connection, then you have to assume a connection. You need to assume that the ideas are connected. If you need examples of these things, feel free to chat box and say, hey, I need examples of these things. But in general, these ideas are explained in much more detail in the previous study hall recording, the one that's directly previous to this one. So from August 8th. Okay. August 8th. So if basically if the argument just goes from something to something else, whoa, no connection. Like Ron is 5'10", therefore Ron is beautiful. Okay, how did we get there? Well, you have to assume that anybody who's 5'10" is beautiful. That kind of thing. So, or what you can also do is think about objections to the argument. This is a much more natural thought process because people are not bad when it comes to objecting to things. I mean, that's something that people naturally do very well. So if you can think of a reasonable objection to the argument, then you need an assumption to dismiss that objection. So, for example, if I say, okay, driving to Portland usually takes 12 hours, so if I leave now, I will get to Portland in 12 hours. One objection could be, oh, what if there's lots of traffic? So you have to assume that there will not be lots of traffic. What if your car breaks down? I have to assume my car will not break down, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, remember your friends here are the answer choices. So don't forget about the negation method. This is really the nuclear option in the sense that it usually makes it much easier to tell when things are okay and not okay as assumptions, or needed or not needed. But when it comes to the negation method, it does take a little bit more time, so that's the downside of it. But it's a very powerful method. When we say negation method, what we mean is, you take, because remember what necessary means here. What necessary means is, it's the same thing that necessary means in the rest of life, which is that if you don't have it, then whatever you're doing will not happen. Like if passing some test is necessary to pass a class, that means if you fail the test, you will not pass the class. If some vitamin is necessary to stay alive, it means if you do not have that vitamin, you will die. So same sort of thing here. Necessary means if the assumption is false, then the argument dies. It becomes invalid. So you can use that as a tool because you have a multiple choice question in front of you. The procedure is basically just take the assumption, take the answer choice, which is supposed to be an assumption. The idea is you don't know if it is one because it's an answer choice, but make it false and then see whether the argument dies. If the argument dies, it's an assumption. So that's basically the idea. So these are all takeaways. If you don't know what that means, or if you're not really like totally okay with that idea, then check out that previous study hall recording, and that should answer a lot of the questions that you had or the uncertainties that you had about it. Again, Josh says I'd only use negation when you have two options left. I mean, I would caution you against having any sort of like doctrinaire thought like that at all about when to use these things. I mean, because the problem with saying something like that, and I don't really mean to like make an example of you here or anything, but the problem with saying something like I would only do this when there are two choices left is like, what if you don't get to that point, right? Like, well, what if you don't reach a point where there are two chances left? Then that sounds like a petty objection, but it's not really, because this is the whole point of this, is that it's a more powerful method that you want to use when the faster methods don't work. So, I mean, if you're looking at a problem and you have no freaking clue here, then you might want to break this thing out earlier. So, and then when it comes to levels of questions, I'm not going to answer that, because answers to questions like that will not help. Yeah, I mean, the best answer there is a non-answer. Because that's not, in fact, the fact that you even have to ask this question should illustrate to you exactly why it's not a good question. Because just think about what that means. The fact that you are even asking this in the first place means I don't know what the level of the question is. And that's the point. You don't know. You have no idea. And that's precisely why it does not matter, because there's no way to make a strategy around things that you don't know. I mean, you would have to, unless you could actually figure that out on the fly during the test. And even if you could, it wouldn't help you anyway, because knowing the level will not help you get a question right. Okay. Let's look at it again. Let's take the question over to, yeah, I mean, Mike, dude, people worry about this stuff all the time, because people are making the mistake there is that people are not thinking about what is just an objective feature of the test versus what is something that will actually influence my strategy. You know, like worrying about difficulty levels of questions is a lot like worrying about what's going on inside your car's brake system instead of worrying about how to drive the car. So it's a thing. I mean, as a test taker, you just want to solve the problems, and that's kind of it, right? So, but let's talk about this on a clean board here. All right, so, and then another thing that is a really big thing here is to own the argument. And what I mean by own the argument is to put it in your own words. So remember, like, put the argument into, in your head, at least, into the form of a, like, dialogue or, like, literal conversation that you're having with someone. Or a personal situation. That's the other thing. Because this is what promotes understanding. If something is a bunch of cold statements on a board, then you're not really going to be able to think about it. Like, this is the biggest thing promoting that. This is the biggest thing as far as promoting thinking and actual understanding. So in other words, you don't want to spend too much time formally classifying statements and stuff. You want to like think about this as though it were happening in the real world. And I mean, depending on what the passage is about, personal situation here is a bit far-fetched because, you know, we're talking about salt in the oceans, and that's not a very personal situation. But in the ones that are in the critical reasonings that are about businesses, it's something you should just make that your business. So if you're reading about some like, you know, I don't know, meat processing plant, just pretend you're an executive doing a case study. Here it's more like I watched this on a nature show or something like that. But whatever it is, make sure that you put it into conversational language and make sure that you're in it as much as possible. So what does this mean? Well, I mean, these sentences are just so long that it's really hard to think intuitively about them, right? That's really what the issue here is. So let's try to rephrase this in terms that the guideline that I always follow when I read these passages is let's put these in terms that a hypothetical 10-year-old or 10 or so year old would understand. Because I mean, most of these you can do that. I mean, there's not really going to be a lot of passages that are full of concepts that, you know, your hypothetical 10-year-old wouldn't get. It's really just the language of the passage that is the issue. I mean, that's what would put a 10-year-old off of this, is the sentences are too long and they're not intuitive. So let's do this, right? So the point is there's a bunch of salt in the water. There's a bunch of salt in the ocean. By the way, don't write a bunch of in like essays and stuff. It's not a thing in formal language. Clearly, therefore, by taking the resulting increase in salt levels over the past 100 years and blah, 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 oh my gosh, there's so many words. What they're saying is the resulting increase over the past 100 years. So they're saying if you do this procedure, according to the speaker here, there's like a dude or a woman who's telling you how you can determine the age of the oceans. So here's the speaker says, let's give the speaker a name. Let's say the speaker's name is Chris. Chris tells us, here's how you can find the age of the oceans. You can just look at the past 100 years. This should get your mind going. See, this is the advantage of putting this into terms like someone is talking to you, because as soon as you see this should give you the heebie-jeebies a little bit. I mean, that should make you think, wait a minute, dude, how is only 100 years of evidence? But even when you just see those words, you should be like, But let's keep doing this, right? And then determining how many centuries of such increases it would have taken the ocean to reach current. So, I mean, in other words, they're saying this is like mx plus b, almost. They're saying, like, if you started from 0 salt, how long would it take you to get to the current level of salt? Okay. So, imagine you want to find the rate, find how much salt builds up per century, so per 100 years. Imagine that you started with 0 salt. And then just basically divide that rate or that amount of salt that we have now by the rate, and it's like R times T, rate times time equals distance kind of thing. So just use that rate, which you're basically, I mean, a 10-year-old doesn't know what extrapolate means, but you can certainly explain it to a 10-year-old. So let's say extrapolate. Extrapolate it over the whole time. to see how long the oceans would take, would need to get all the way up to where they are. Okay, I mean, that is much simpler language than what is up there, and this will undoubtedly help you understand what the issue is. So again, Chris or whoever is telling us about this kind of thing, just imagine someone you know who is kind of a nature show nerd. I mean, if you have a friend who's really into these kinds of things, that'll even help you, because if you imagine that friend talking to you, it'll become much easier to imagine that someone is actually telling you these things. And what's interesting here is that we have a very big plurality of responses. In fact, it's a majority of responses in favor of a wrong answer choice. So here's what you guys picked. And that E there, that big long bar for E at the bottom, is actually not a correct answer to this problem. But if you make this a conversation like we did here, it'll become clear why it's not. So, because okay, back to the previous screen where we had all these things about assumptions. So, what is an assumption? Well, okay, something we need. But how do you find assumptions here? Like, let's consider for a moment this. You can think of a reasonable objection to the argument. Hey, Chris, here's a reason why your method might be bunk. If you can think of anything that is a gigantically huge issue with this thing, or even not that gigantically huge, but ideally gigantically huge, if you can think of a big problem with this, then you have to assume away the problem. You have to get rid of it by just assuming it's not a thing. So let's talk about this. I mean, again, see, if someone's telling you this is how to find the age of the ocean, that's the difference. It's not a bunch of cold, lifeless statements on paper that are hard to animate anymore. Like, it becomes, oh, hey, this is intuitive. Let me just, like, think about this. Like, if this person is standing in front of you and saying, yo, all you have to do is look at the last 100 years, can anybody find an objection to that? I mean, let's get rid of the answer choices for a second. How could you object to this? Chat box, tell me a story. Yeah, right? I mean, basically, as soon as you see, whoa, let's just look at the last 100 years, the immediate thought that comes to mind will probably be, what? Why just the last 100 years? Like, do the last 100 years really tell you the whole story of the history of the ocean? I mean, not really, right? So, objection, wait a minute. What if the last 100 years doesn't tell the whole story? What if it's not? What if that period isn't representative? And I mean, okay, as far as having this objection come to mind, I mean, if you are thinking about this intuitively enough, then this objection should be it should just pop into your head. It should just happen. Because, I mean, again, let's make an analogy that is more intuitive, and you'll see my point here. Like, let's say, here's how to tell how much money someone probably has in their savings account. Well, let's just look at how much they saved in the last 1 year, and then multiply that by the number of years they've been earning income. I mean, you can see what the problem is here. I mean, in that case, everybody is going to think right away, dude, what if their, like, income or spending has changed before the last year? I mean, people don't save exactly the same amount of money every single year. So that's probably kind of obvious. And if you would make that connection thinking about someone's savings account, but you would not make that connection here, you see what the problem is. The problem is not that you don't understand logic or that you have to learn a bunch of rules or like stuff like that. The point is that you are not thinking enough about it. You're trying to be too logic-y about it. You're not personalizing the situation. This is really what matters. This is the thing that matters the most of all the things. So what we need to assume, we need to assume that that's not an objection, basically. We have to assume that the last 100 years does tell the whole story. In other words, you have to assume that there were no like wildly different rates of salt accumulation before that period. We have to assume that 100 years is enough time to tell us the whole story. So that is A. That's the choice that we want. Because we definitely need to assume this, right? Like this is saying, look at what this is saying. It's saying that the 100 years is not, I mean, they specifically said not unusually large, but if you replace large with small here, it would still be a correct answer. It would still be, like, basically the last 100 years is not weird compared to the rest of history. So this is the choice that you want. And what should really strike you here is how easy it will be to come up with these objections if you are thinking about these things as real life situations, as opposed to like cold collection of statements on a screen. So that's the secret. The secret is imagine that you are talking to a person and not, analyzing an academic problem. Can't emphasize that enough. If you think of these as academic problems, they'll be very hard. If you think of them as conversations with people, they will be much less hard. That is the secret of CR. So, Josh, if you tell me what you didn't like about the wording, then I can tell you a story about it. Okay. The other answer choices here, I mean, this choice is not really a thing, right? Because the point is that salt levels increase. So B is, not only is B not necessary, but B is, it pretty much has to be false. I mean, B cannot be true because otherwise your salt level would not even be increasing in the first place. So something that's false definitely is not going to be an assumption that's required. So that dismisses this option. This can't even be true. And the reason, again, why it can't be true is that we know that the salt levels are going up. They're not staying the same. And then if this means, the other thing this statement could mean is that they have all the same levels as each other. But, and then wait a minute, there's an even bigger problem with this, which is it's not even talking about the ocean, it's talking about rivers. So the thing that we're talking about in the passage is ocean. So yeah, what? And again, if you're conversationizing this, including the answer choices, that's the difference between, okay, my first analysis and this one is I thought of this not as someone talking until now. But now I'm thinking of it as someone raising their hand in this little forum with our expert Chris and saying, what about the rivers? And Chris is like, dude, this is the oceans. It's not the rivers. So this is not a thing. Okay. There are salts that leach into the Earth's oceans directly from the ocean floor. Well, okay. But, I mean, number one, this would not be necessary. I mean, remember, it doesn't really matter how. I mean, there's no necessary way for the salt to get there. The point is just that the salt gets there. So, nothing, I mean, there's no necessary way for the salt to get there. And I mean, besides that, we don't even care how the salt gets there at all, because that's not the point. The point is we're just looking at rates. So we also don't really care about that. Someone, if you have a question, please type it in the chat box. So the option. Let's go through the choices here first, and then I'll address these things that are on the board. This one, there is no method superior to that based on salt levels. Well, I mean, that's not the point. We're not talking about other ways. We're just talking about whether Chris's way is a thing. And then this is the popular wrong answer. So, but again, if you know what you're talking about here, you should be able to dismiss this, because again, the deal is we're just looking at rates. We're just looking at an aggregate rate. We don't really so much care where that rate comes from, what the genesis of it is, or what is physically happening, right? I mean, this would all be, even if there are salts used up by biological activity, that's going to be taken into account when you look at this rate here. So, like, even if this were to happen, even if this were a thing, it would be part of the rate that you get. It would already be. It would just be factored into that. Basically, is the idea. It would be factored into the observed rate. So, but you don't need a complete calculation, because that's the point. So I mean, the best thing to do if you really don't get these things is to make an analogy to an easier to think about real life thing. So let's do that. Because a lot of people take the answer choice E. So we need intuition to make this work. Let's make an analogy. In fact, let's just run with the analogy that I made earlier. So, and then we'll return to the original question in a second. So, okay, Jim puts money into his savings account. Constantly carries salt into the oceans is like Jim puts money into his savings account every paycheck. So clearly, if we look at how much money he saved from his last pay period, or like from the last 1 year or whatever, then like see how many times he'd have to do that, and then see how long it would take him to reach his current balance. Then we can tell how long Jim has been working. And if you want to put numbers to this, ideally you shouldn't have to think about specific numbers. But let's say that you really don't have a handle on this and you want to think about specific numbers to really put some intuition on it, then feel free to do that. It'll eat a little bit of time, but if that's what helps you get an intuition, then it's definitely worth it. So for example, if Jim saved, I don't know, $10,000 in the last year, and then he has $200,000 in savings, therefore he must have started working 20 years ago. I mean, that's basically the logic here, except it's with money instead of salt, and money is easier to think about than salt, which is the point. So, okay. In this case, it should be very clear that A is the right answer, right? I mean, A says, in the case of Jim and his savings, A would say Jim did not, save an unusually high amount of money in this last year. I mean, it should be very, very clear that we need this. Because, I mean, if Jim, if $10,000 is not thanks, KD, appreciate it. If $10,000 is not how much Jim normally saves, then of course this whole way of figuring this out is nonsense. Like if he normally saves a lot less than that, and then whoa, income increase. Right. B is, okay, let's say that we're talking about 1 year at a time. I mean, B is like the different things that feed into the paycheck or whatever, or the savings account. So B would be something like Jim saves like exactly the same amount of money every month over the course of the year. We don't really need that because we're looking at a yearly. I mean, if Jim saves a lot less money at Christmas time, for instance, that's factored into looking at 1 year. Choice C would be something like, where does the money come from, which we don't, I mean, Jim gets some money as, I don't know, from a trust fund that his late father left him. So, I mean, you can see why we don't need that. There's two big problems there. The first is we honestly don't care where the money even comes from in the first place, because we're just looking at dollars. We don't care of what the source of the dollars is. And also, the other thing here is that even if that were an issue, we wouldn't have to assume that any particular thing was the source. D is there's no better way to figure out how long Jim has been working. And I mean, that doesn't make any difference because all we're trying to do is just say, can you figure it out this way? We're not trying to answer the question of, is this a stupid way to figure it out? We're just trying to answer, is it a way to figure it out? And then choice E, which is really the kind of, I guess, champion of all wrong answers here. E would be something like Jim doesn't Jim doesn't have to Rajnish, don't use the raise hand thing, please. Just write your questions in the text box. Okay. So E would be something, because I mean we're talking about salts being used up by certain processes as opposed to accumulating in the ocean. In terms of a savings account, this would be like money being frittered away on something instead of saved. So like Jim doesn't donate any of his money to charity instead of saving it. I mean, you can see why this is not a factor, right? Because even if Jim donates 10% of his income to charity or whatever, that's going to be factored into this $10,000. I mean, it's going to be part of that. So, and if this is easier, then if this is easier to think about, then that's the connection. This is probably much easier to think about because, oh, well, I mean, such a mundane topic. But that's the point. So like, your goal is to get to the point where it is just as easy for you to think about salt in the ocean intuitively as it is to think about savings accounts. And I mean, the best way for me to kind of summarize that is that your goal here is to become a nerd. What I mean by that is, like, I'm a very nerdy person, and what that means is not that I'm, like, really smart or anything. It just means that I think all the time about, like, things that are not directly pertinent to my real life. You know, I'm interested in random things. So you want to get to that point, because what the essence of being a nerd is be able to think intuitively the same way you'd think about real life ideas. About random things. that's your goal. Your goal is to get to the point where salt in the ocean is just as easy to think about as savings accounts. So, because it should be very clear why E is not an issue here, but it's the same reason why this is not an issue here. I mean, it's all wrapped up into this overall rate that we're looking at. Okay, so let's take a look at. I mean, okay, the key word in A is, all right, so let's take this to another page. And now that we have this whole savings account thing, all right, here we go. Here's another page. Okay, let's address some of the thingies on the board. Okay, here's one question. I don't really love the way this question is being asked. Well, let me tell you what I mean by that. You shouldn't even think in these terms. I mean, because when you say keyword, again, you're still making this. You're not thinking like a nerd. I mean, you're thinking that there's going to be like some word that is like a logic tip-off or something like that. It's not the right way to think about that. I mean, you really want to just think about what the statement means, and that's all you want to think about. So, like, don't worry about like parsing the statement. Like, don't try to parse the statements. Like, don't try to break them down into like words or units or whatever. Like, just think about what the words mean. Because, I mean, I could take out unusual and express that in a different way. I mean, I could say, you know, the quantities of salt dissolved in the oceans have not, you know, increased rapidly during the last 100 years. I mean, you know, it has not. There has been no significant change in the quantity of salt deposited over the last 100 years or whatever. So, but that's not, I mean, if it's clearer, then that's what the problem is, because this should, if you're thinking about it in the right way, then this should be every bit as clear as those other things, which is just, what is this even saying, rather than breaking down the keywords or whatever. Okay, but I'm glad that helps. Let's see what the, Josh, I'm not super clear on what your point is here. I mean, if you could try to rephrase it or something. Well, let me tell you what I'm not really understanding about what you wrote, which is these are not really opposites. I mean, a little unusual is not the opposite of unusually large, but even so, I mean, the fact that it's unusually large is not at all the issue. I mean, even if the point here is just that, I mean, the point is that we can't have any abnormalities of whatever type. If that, I spelled that wrong, I'll fix that in a second. We can't have any abnormalities if this method is supposed to work. So, I mean, even if you change the word large to small, it's still an assumption. I mean, if you change large to small in this answer choice, it's still an assumption. I mean, for the same reason that in the savings account problem that I just kind of made up on the fly here. I mean, if you remember, A is saying, you know, Jim didn't save more than he usually saves this year. You need that. If he saved a lot of money this year, then it's going to screw up our calculation. But you would also need to know Jim did not save like an unusually small amount of money this year, because that would still mess up the calculation for exactly the same reason. So hopefully that helps. If you still have questions about this, then feel free to ask. Okay. All right. It's already calculated the last 100 years. So, KD, you got the right answer to this. So I think you were maybe trying to correct that person's thought process. If you had an actual question, then feel free. This is, Rajnesh says, If that were what option B said, then yes, it would be an assumption, but that's not what option B says. I mean, option B says that, I mean, first of all, it doesn't make any difference because we're talking about salt levels in rivers and not the oceans. That's one issue here. So one issue is just that's not what it says. And even if it were talking about oceans, it's still not an issue because, I mean, this choice is talking about, you know, like, it's talking about salt levels in different places around the world at any one time, not rates. I mean, there's no changes going on here at all. It's just if you took a static measurement around the world, then it would be the same. We don't care because again, it's the ocean. It's not the rivers. It's the ocean. Okay. Let's see. If some salt is used up, then we can't get a complete. See, this is where you just have to. I mean, I can't really respond to this directly as a question because the problem is that the intuition is not there when you say something like this. And so, I mean, the only way I can effectively respond to that is by making analogies, like I just did. So if some salt is used up, then, I mean, but this is, I mean, basically I can just be like, no. Because again, think about the savings account thing. This is like saying if Jim spends money on anything at all, then we can't think about his savings per year. Which, I mean, you should probably realize that that's not a thing, right? I mean, when you look at how much he's saving, that is affected by his spending on things, but of course it's still a rate. I mean, if he makes 100,000 and spends 90, that's still, you know, we don't have to know that. We just have to know that he saves X amount per year. Okay, and then that Ruchi that answers your question, it's the same question that you have. Ruchi. So this question here is answered by the same principle. Let me move these things upward so that I can fit this. Okay, so there. This question is answered by the same principle up there. Because Ruchi, what you're saying is like, it's like saying even if Jim spends some money, will that mess up our calculation? No, of course it won't. I mean, as long as we know about savings, we don't care. Like, we don't care what % of Jim's money he is saving. We just care how much money he's saving. So, same sort of issue there. All right. I think that takes care of the questions. Let's move on to another problem here. And remember, these kinds of analogies, let me tell you what I'm not doing here because sometimes this is unclear when we go over analogies like this. Well, what I am absolutely not doing here, and what would be sort of ridiculous if I was doing it, would be, I'm not telling you that you should make analogies like this while you are reading the problem, because that would be kind of absurd. Like, there's no way that would be possible in the time frame that you have. I mean, you can't make that full analogy in like a minute or two. At least you probably can. If you can, then run with it, but it's not what you want to do. But what you want, the reason I'm doing this is because these kinds of analogies really illustrate the mental state that you have to be in to solve these problems. You know, it has nothing to do with classifying things or formal logic or anything like that. And I mean, guys, if this was formal logic, it would just be part of the quant section. That's basically why there is a quant section. The quant section is there to determine how well can you manipulate rules to solve problems. That's the quant section. The reason this section is here is because it is not that. It's here because now it's testing how well can you think about case studies in the same way you think about normal human things like bank accounts. So if you're taking the quant section approach to this, then you are going to face a lot of trouble that you will not face if you think about these things the way you would think about gym. That's the point. So the value in making analogies like this, and the reason why you should try to do it yourself, is that you want to make sure that you can get your head in the right place, is the best way I can summarize that. Let's try another one. How about this? So again, remember where we have the answer choices. The answer choices are here. Go for it. And here's a timer for you. Have a good time with that. Okay, apparently this is a fun one because only about 10 of you have answered it so far out of, what, 20, 26, 27 people. So take another not very long, take another short moment to wrap it up, but go ahead and answer it. Because remember, it's the GMAT. On the GMAT, there's no such thing as a not answer. So please answer the problem in the next, say, 10, 15 seconds. Thanks. Okay, let's discuss. Again, this can't be emphasized enough, but the secret, which is not really a secret to all of this, is to intuit it, to make it a normal situation. And the way that you want to do that is you want to tone down the language. You want to make it so that it's like a, again, conversation that a hypothetical 10-year-old would understand. So let's think about that. Let's explain it in simple terms. At least in your head, do this. Because, there's so many big words here. I had to read that first sentence like 5 times when I read this because, whoa, there's so many words and there's no punctuation. That's the problem. You have to, make it real. You have to make it a sentence that is not so complicated. What this means is, okay, our critics, so the other side, people accuse us. Our critics claim blah, 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 so they're going to be accusing us of something, right? That's why they're critics. So they claim that they canceled a bunch of highway projects. And the complaint is that this is revenge against the other side. So people accuse us, we are being accused. We've been accused of canceling highway projects, road work, specifically in areas where, if this is a Democratic president, so let's say the president is Obama, who is a Democrat, so the president's party is a Democrat. And even making this into Democrats and Republicans will still make this easier to think about because the party and the opposition party are such weird abstractions, but Democrats and Republicans are not. So if you just make it Democrats and Republicans, it will magically be easier to think about. So we've been accused of canceling road work in Republican districts, specifically to be haters of Republicans, specifically to punish those districts for being the other party. That's what that means. And then the people who are accusing us point out The people who are accusing us, the accusers point out 90% of the cancellations were in these areas. But then, I mean, remember who's talking here. Like, you know what the point is. This is Obama's press secretary. So, of course, they're trying to dismiss the charges against Obama. They're trying to say Obama and his people did not do the wrong thing here. So, but all of these were, like, projects that were identified as being, like, money squandering projects. So, but all of these things, all of the things we canceled, like, were flagged by, like, auditors or whoever, were flagged as wasteful or unnecessary. And so meaning things that should have been canceled, and so we did nothing wrong. Let's make an analogy just in case it's unclear what the deal is here. So, let's make an analogy. Okay. Let's say that I don't know, let's say that our company is, like, let's say our company fired a bunch of workers. And let's say that most of the workers they fired were older. So our company has been accused of discriminating again. So let's say, like, our company's fired a bunch of women who work for us. So our company's been accused of discriminating against women since we fired a bunch of women recently. So canceling highway projects is like firing employees here. And then they say, well, you know, 90% of the, like, 9 of every 10 people fired recently have been women. So that seems like pretty strong evidence, right? But the objection here is kind of like saying, but all of the people fired were, you know, people who had been doing bad work, or people who had, you know, had gotten previous warnings, or some sort of reason why they should be fired. So previous warnings, or had violated ethics policies, or whatever. So we did nothing wrong. Okay, well, I mean, this might be easier to think about, you know, because you all work presumably at some job, so it's probably easier to think about people getting hired and fired from this job. This is still highway projects, probably a little bit more remote. So let's think about this instead. I mean, what do we need here? So A would say something like, you know, firing people isn't the only, you know, punishment. We don't care. Because, I mean, even if you could, like, dock someone's pay instead or whatever, that's not what's the issue here. What's at issue here is our company unfairly targeting women to be fired? No, I mean, even if it were a pay cut, it would still be the same issue. Are they unfairly doing that to the female workers? Still the same issue. B says the highway projects identified as wasteful were not mostly in the Democratic areas. That would become, like, the Democratic areas here would be people who are not female, and the ones in the other party would be, like, females, the people who were being accused of punishing. So B would be something like, of the workers, like the workers the workers who've gotten warnings or who've violated ethics rules are not mostly male. I mean, we need that, right? Because, I mean, this is definitely a thing. I mean, if you want to try negation here, you know, definitely try. I mean, negation here will make it clear in a second that this is the answer that you want. Because, and this is not the answer that most people pick. I mean, let me just go ahead and put the stats up here on the board. Here's what you guys said. I mean, most of you guys like choice E again here. So, this is another, apparently this problem is challenging to at least to this group today or whatever, but I mean, you know, if you do the negation here, I mean, if you do the negation, it will become very clear what the issue is here. The negation is something like, if this is false, then most of the reprimanded or unethical workers, in other words, the ones who should be fired, i.e. the ones whose firing would be justified, are male. Whoa, problem. I mean, to be very clear what the problem is there. Like, if we know that, because I mean, what the company is saying is that all the people who were fired are people who, like, we had a reason to fire. But if we had a reason to fire all these other people who were men, and we didn't fire them, then you know that there is something sketchy going on here, and that's the point. So C is the number of projects canceled was a significant. I mean, this just means we fired like a high percentage of our people. I mean, that's not relevant. I mean, we fired a large percent of our employees. I mean, we don't care. That's not an issue here. Like, even if we're talking about a small number of employees in a huge company, or we're talking about half of all of them, it doesn't make any difference. Because if you have disproportionate firings, you still have disproportionate firings. It doesn't matter how they correspond to the company as a whole. D, the highway projects were not generally more expensive. So, I mean, the workers that were fired were not higher paid than other workers. Again, we don't care. Because, I mean, the issue here is not, and the issue in our analogy is not that they're firing the, like, highly paid employees. The issue is that they're unfairly firing women. So this is a non-issue. In the original argument, the issue is not that they're canceling expensive projects. The issue is that they're canceling projects that are in Republican districts. So you want to stay focused on what the problems actually are here. And then E, which is the choice that people like, is people, like when you have reports about firings, the opposition party, so the opposition party here would correspond to like female workers. Like female workers don't trust the numbers of firings reported by the company. I mean, this is an interesting, I mean, I kind of wonder what the appeal of this choice is, because I mean, apparently there's some kind of strong appeal, because this is the choice that most of you pick. But this is, I mean, not only is this not necessary, but it's kind of, I mean, you kind of want the opposite of this. Because, I mean, if you think about how this argument works, the people who are making the complaint are making the complaint on the basis of the numbers that were reported. So if you think about it, like in order for in our thing with the women and the firing and stuff here, I mean, this whole idea depends fundamentally on the idea that the people who are complaining actually believe the numbers that are reported. Because what the complainers are doing is they're taking the reported numbers and being like, whoa, I cry foul. But, you know, the underlying foundation of that is that they have to believe the numbers in the first place. So not only is this not a necessary thing, but this is not even a thing that would help us. So back to the original thing again, I mean, this is saying the Republicans don't believe the numbers that the Democrats put out. There's nothing there saying they don't believe the numbers. I mean, what they don't believe is the motivation behind the numbers. But nobody is questioning the validity of the report itself. So the author uses a report. I thought that the KD, before you said you have to look for a leap. I didn't say you have to. Let's get some of this off the board. Okay, and then this is going to be the last question today. We can roll over a few minutes because of the tech issue that we had earlier, but we got 5 minutes hard stop here. I didn't say you had to. Let me go back to the screen where we talked about that. What I said was that was one way of several to proceed. I mean, if there is an obvious jump, then you can find it, but that's not the only way to go. Like, remember what we said here was, we said this. I mean, this is one way to think about it, but it's not the only way. I mean, you could also think about objections, or you could use the negation thing. I mean, there are lots of ways to go here, and that's one of those ways. So hopefully that's clear. Yeah, no, it's not. You don't have to do anything. That's why there are lots of options. Let's see. Yeah, because you won't always see a gap. I mean, in some cases there won't be a gap. In some cases it'll be an objection that we just didn't think about, and that's why there's no gap. You know, like a lot of arguments will seem to have no gap precisely because there is some like huge elephant in the room that we just didn't think about. So that's kind of the issue here. And again, the way that you're going to think about, I mean, the question that comes to mind there is, whoa, how am I going to think about things they didn't mention? And the answer to that is, if you think about this like a real life situation, it's much easier to do that. If you think about these things as cold collections of logical statements on a screen, you will not be able to do it. But if you think about them as real world situations, it's not so bad. I thought the author uses a report as evidence. I mean, yeah, the author does, but again, we don't need the idea that somebody would mistrust that report. In fact, quite the opposite. So, and in fact, you're kind of making the case here that E is a wrong answer. So, exactly. The point is that everyone involved does trust the statistics. Like the point is specifically that people do not disbelieve the numbers. The point is that they're being like, whoa, these numbers represent a big problem, but nobody is questioning the report itself. Because the report doesn't go into why. The report is just like, here is how many highway projects we canceled, or here's what if the info in the report is wrong? What do you think that would accomplish? First of all, that's not an objection here in the first place. The objection is, like, if you look at this answer choice says that people don't trust the report, which is not. What you're inquiring about is a different issue. What you're inquiring about is whether the report is factually accurate. That's not what E says. So that would be, I mean, if KD and L, if they said something like that, it would be a thing. So your thoughts are not totally without value here, but you just have to read the words in the answer choice very carefully. You can slow down if you have to. Take whatever time you need to read these things, because you really have to understand what they say and what they don't say. Like this goes into choice E has nothing to do with the accuracy of the report. If it did, it could be problematic. But accuracy is not an issue here in this choice. In this choice, the issue is it's just the way in which the aggrieved group perceives things. So that's the point. The way that people who feel wronged here, how do they feel about it? And that's not yeah. So the point is to not invest all of your thoughts in one thing that you come up with, because as you have seen here, they might come up with something else, and both of you might be valid, but unfortunately, if it's not in the choice, it's not in the choice. Okay, now. The last thing, we got to run here in a sec, but how do we get better on timing? I mean, before you worry about that, make sure that you're even thinking about these in the right way in the first place. I mean, if you're not making these conversations or shows that you watched or some sort of personal thing in the first place, that's issue number one. And you don't even want to worry about timing until you have that under control, until you are even thinking about these things in the right way. Once you get that under control, then you can worry about, timing, which is probably just an issue of focusing on the goal at hand and not digressing off into irrelevant stuff. Okay. If the opposition party trusts the report, they would know that those 90% of projects were wasteful. Yeah, Naveen, you're still not seeing the point here, though. The point is that the 90% doesn't mean anything unless we know the whole thing. Because again, look at our analogy. I mean, even if people know that these women were fired for a good reason, that doesn't prove that it's not discrimination. Because if there were a lot of men who should have also been fired but weren't, then the 90% is not counter evidence here. Hold on just a second. Hey. All right, so we've got to run here in a sec, but yeah, so hopefully that addresses, Naveen, your point, which is that kind of thinking is still not taking this into account. I mean, the point is that the numbers in the report are real figures, but that the accusations are still accusations. Okay, if you have other questions about this kind of thing, if you have anything super quick, feel free to throw it up there. If not, we have a few more of these in store, so I think we're going to do another session because apparently this is a very fruitful discussion. It's fruitful enough that with only, 2 problems plus an initial discussion that we filled the whole time and more. So I think we, yeah, guys, the recordings are online. I don't think there's any way to get still slides of it, but you can watch the recordings from the Thursdays with Ron webpage. So, yeah. How many of these kinds of things are on the GMAT? Usually assumption questions, you'll see 1 or 2. It's not as significant as, it's not as significant as strengthening and weakening in that family, which is much more common. But you'll see it. I mean, you will definitely see problems that ask you about assumptions. But at the same time, it's not everything in the world. It's not like all of the things. So yeah. Okay. Thanks. We're definitely hitting a hard stop here. I gotta log you guys out. Thank you for attending. Sorry about the small tech glitch at the beginning, but we definitely still got all the time. And we're gonna do some more of this next time because there's still some more ready to go here. And thanks, guys. Good night and good luck.